President, you may be seated. The court is now back in session. For this afternoon session and for tomorrow proceeding, we will continue to hear the testimony of witness Ong Thong Heung. And for this afternoon, he will be questioned by the prosecution. Before I hand the floor to the prosecution, I'd like to inquire with the prosecution and the legal lawyers that they shall allocate the time amongst themselves to conclude the session with this witness for this afternoon and tomorrow morning session. So please consult amongst yourself and try to use the time allocated to both parties.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good afternoon, Your Honours. To clarify the question of the distribution of time, I'm thinking of using this afternoon to ask questions to the witness and to leave some room for the civil parties tomorrow morning. I'm hoping to be able to finish by 4 o'clock. Thank you, Mr. President.
Oui, bonjour, Monsieur.
Good afternoon, Mr. President. Good afternoon to all. As far as we are concerned, one morning will be more than adequate. We might even be finished before the morning is finished tomorrow.
Thank you. The prosecution, you may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, witness, for your patience and for coming again this afternoon, and thank you very much as well for coming all the way from Brussels to assist us in finding the truth. I have some follow-up questions that I'd like to ask you in connection with what you were saying yesterday to my colleague, and then we will resume your narrative, which I think came to a close at D2. Please also bear in mind that what we are interested in is what you knew at the time, rather than what you may have learnt afterwards by, for example, reading S21 confessions. So please do take great pains to make that distinction between what you heard at the time and other things. So my first question concerns the Khmer Student Union. The Khmer Student Union, was it more pro-Soviet or pro-Chinese in the days when you were a member?
As far as I know, from the inception of the Khmer Students Union in France, it did not have the same tendency as that of the French student unions. The Khmer Students Union was formed with the assistance of the French Students Union and that of the Soviet Unions. So we can say that the Khmer Students' Union kind of having a tendency towards the Soviet Union.
Merci. Pendant combien de...
Thank you. How long did the KSU go on functioning from the days when you were a member in the 1970s?
The exact date of the dissolution of the association was not clear to me. However, I can remember that it was dissolved at the instructions of Ieng Sari. However, I'd like to expand it a little bit further for ease of understanding. After the contradictions regarding the ideology between the Soviet Union and the revisionists within the Communist Party of Soviet and the Communist Party of China, the situation within the Khmer Students' Union in France was also in the contradictory stage. In particular, those young students who recently arrived in France at the time were mainly bent toward China, and they hate that kind of tendency since they were in Cambodia. And as far as I knew, the Khmer Students Association led by Kuk Chai at that time in Cambodia followed the tendency or were closely related to China than to Soviet.
Merci.
Thank you. Yesterday you also talked about the office of the Funk or Grunk Mission in Paris, and it was the second most important Funk office. It was run by Oksok Gun, who disseminated the Funk Bulletin in Paris. Now, did you get a copy of this bulletin at home? Or were you by any other means able to read this bulletin?
Not only I read the bulletin, but I also assisted in the production of the bulletin as well, as I was a student as part of the Funk back then.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. President, I would like to show the witness a document. It's IS 12.3, also carrying code E3/113. It's a bulletin that is disseminated by the Information Bureau of the Funk, entitled News of Cambodia, Kampuchea Information Agency. And I just want to take one issue, number 693, from the 4th of April 1974. And if I may, I'll show the French original to the witness and also bring it up on the screen in the Khmer version, if I may.
President, yes, you may proceed. Court officer, could you take the hard copy for the witness examination?
Monsieur le témoin, je vais vous laisser.
I'll let you consult the document, witness. I'm not so interested in the content as in the appearance of it. Can you tell us if this type of bulletin was the one that you regularly read in Paris when you were there?
But
Yes, that is correct.
Alors, simplement, si vous attardez
If we look at the first page, you can see the kind of content just by looking at the titles of the article which are contained inside. There's an article about crimes committed by Phnom Penh traitors against pagodas and bonzes. And then there's another part of the issue that concerns a trip by Mr. Yang Sari and Kyu Sampan to China. And the third part is about the military situation at home. Would you say that that is the kind of article that you would normally find in this Funk bulletin at the time? Or are there aspects that seem to be missing in this particular issue?
I can confirm that this document has a similar content to the content of the documents that I read back then.
Vous nous avez dit que le bureau.
You told us that the mission office was very active. Did they distribute other materials such as government communiques or declarations and statements by ministers of the Grunk government?
When I talked about the missions by Fung to Europe, were the most important missions similar to that to Peking, because it had the biggest office in Paris, and in relation to the dissemination of information in the bulletins or in the major newspapers, then it would mean the information would be spread throughout the world. So it became the biggest center for Funk overseas, besides the one in Peking.
In the information bulletins which you read in those days, or other communications from Funk, were you used to seeing references to super traitors before the fall of Phnom Penh? Does that ring a bell from what you read at the time?
At that time, although I myself did not like to use such a violent word, I did not have any reaction against it.
Je voudrais maintenant.
remaining for one moment with the meetings that you may have attended when Yang Sari was in Paris with the Khmer student community in Paris. I'd like, Mr. President, to read an excerpt from the witness's transcript and then ask him some questions. I'm talking about D141/1 or E3/97, and in French it's page 4 in English, and pages 6 and 7 in Khmer. I'd like to project it onto the screen, and I would like to ask the witness if he prefers to see the French or the Khmer version.
Please display in the Khmer language. You may proceed, the prosecutor court officer. Could you deliver the copy to the witness?
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Donc, page 6 et 7.
Thank you. Pages 6 and 7 in the Khmer language. So I will read the extract here. I quote, Yang Sari came to Paris several times with delegations. For example, while travelling to conferences of non-aligned countries as Minister of Foreign Affairs. We were informed of such visits, and like everyone else, I used to go and listen to what he had to say. He always carried the same message, consisting in justifying the country's policies and asserting that all was fine and that life in Cambodia was good. And then, lower down, I know that Yang Sari even addressed the United Nations General Assembly, where he stated that his country had never been more prosperous and happier over the last 2,000 years. End of quote. So, witness, I need to clarify a point here. You said that Yang Sari came to Paris several times, but you personally, how many times did you see him and go and listen to him speak at these sorts of meetings with students and intellectuals in Paris? Once, twice, several times? Please tell us.
I can say it is more than 2 or more than 3 times.
Est-ce que c'était...
Would this have been after the victory of the 17th of April, when he was already Minister of Foreign Affairs, or prior to that?
I had met him prior to the victory, and also met him at least once after the victory. I did not meet him personally, but I met him during the meeting.
Est-ce qu'après la victoire...
After the victory, when you'd seen him at least once, was he welcomed as a hero of the revolution?
I remember that he was not only received as a hero, but the status was much larger than that.
Est-ce qu'il a...
So did he have particularly significant prestige with the Khmer community in Paris and the students at the time?
At that time, yes, he had a great influence over the intellectuals and students over there, primarily because he had many of his friends who worked there as the core group, and those core group actually educated us, the younger groups, as well.
Hier,
Yesterday you quoted the names of Insopip and Swung Sikun. Did you have other people, did you notice other people from these circles accompanying him on this visit after the 17th of April? And I'm thinking in particular of So Hong.
Among those who accompanied Ieng Sary, I had the great impression with So Hong, as I met him in person and I actually had a chat with him. He was the one who came from inside the country, and I was away from the country for more than 10 years. So I tried to speak with him to learn about the situation back home. And his name actually stuck out.
lors de
At these meetings, in order to convince people to go back to the country, did Ieng Sary evoke patriotism and nationalism to convince them to come back, to rebuild the country, or what sort of terms did he use to put this message across?
He mainly talked about nationalism, patriotism, self-mastery, self-dependent, and he repeatedly emphasized on the point that Cambodia was not an umbrella country to Vietnam. It means that Cambodians, wherever they lived, would like to hear about that.
Est-ce qu'il vous
Did he also talk about the difficulties the country was going through after the liberation of Phnom Penh and the immediate aftermath? Did he say that the situation was difficult?
He did not talk about this issue, as I recall, but he gave an example of those who had returned to the country, namely Sung Si Kun, and that they were happy joining the struggle with the people. So we were so anxious upon hearing that to return to the country and to perform the task as the one that did by Sung Si Kun.
Est-ce que Ieng Sary ou bien
Did the people who were close to Ieng Sary at these meetings tell you that as an intellectual you would have to go through a re-education process when you got back to the country?
I know that he talked about the self-rebuilding, but we didn't know that we had to starve ourselves to engage in hard labor as we did. We could never imagine of such a situation, or perhaps we did not pay much attention to that. Probably what we thought at the time was to rebuild ourselves in order to accustom to the way the local people were living in the country.
What about the appeals that were made at these meetings, especially after April 75? These appeals to you all to go back to the country, were they acted upon by the student community and by the intellectual community in Paris?
It had great influence because Cambodians at the time, even some of them had their foreign spouses, they had to sacrifice and leave their family behind, sold their house or properties in order to contribute to the rebuilding of the country. Together with the Cambodian people inside the country.
Can you provide us with names of friends or of people who were attending these meetings and who decided, following the meetings with Ieng Sary, to return to Cambodia?
I cannot recall them all, but to my recollection, one of them was Tijan Lane. He was a former engineer. Mr. Ieng Sary told him that Ieng Sary needed Tijan Lane because he was an engineer. And Mr. Tijan Lane was also a renowned person in France, and he lived with a Dixon family in France as well, and he had he left his wife and his children behind in France, and his children in France. He left his family and his wife in France. Lee Nai Sim and Pan Trivan was also two of them who were called to come. Lee Nai Sim was a medical doctor. He brought along with him his small kid. He sold his house and he donated money to the organization. There were many other friends who resided in France and decided to left France in order to come to Cambodia. But unfortunately, those people have already passed away.
Thank you. Between the liberation of Phnom Penh and when you returned to Cambodia, do you know how many people back then, how many Khmer people living abroad, returned to Cambodia to participate in its reconstruction?
Witness, please observe the light on the mic. Make sure that it is on before you respond. Response. According to my research and according to my knowledge of the situation at the time, as well as the document collected at the École Française, the total Cambodian returnees who returned to Cambodia accounted for around 1,700 of them, and only 200 of them survived. And I could recover some of the names of those individuals who died when they returned to Cambodia. I could only recover some of those people's names.
Merci.
Thank you. I simply wish to return now to what you said yesterday when you stated that Ieng Sary, before you returned to Cambodia, of course, but during the UN General Assembly, gave a press conference during which he said the evacuees from Phnom Penh would return back home. Was this kind of information on the part of Ieng Sary something that helped you feel more comfortable about the situation in Cambodia?
Yes, those words encouraged us to believe that those national compatriots who resisted in Cambodia were intellectual people. I never believed that they would do anything that kill their own nation.
President, I would like now to show another document to the witness, document E3/550, which is also indexed as IS 20.4. This is an excerpt of an interview that Ieng Sary provided to Newsweek on 8 September 1975. And we would like to look at page 2 in the Khmer version, English the first page, and French it is the second page. And with your leave, I wish to provide a French paper copy of this document to the witness and to display on the screen the Khmer translation.
President, you may proceed. Court officer, please obtain the document from the prosecution and hand it over to the witness.
So this is what Ieng Sary answers to a question from James Pringle from Newsweek magazine. The question is the following. Is Phnom Penh still deserted of its population? Answer, no. About 100,000 people have returned, and others are returning little by little. Schools, hospitals, and factories have gradually resumed their activities. People can go back to Phnom Penh if they wish, or they can stay in the countryside. All of our people are working day and night to rebuild the country. Cambodia is like a giant workshop. End of quote. So in relation to what you told us yesterday, witness, regarding the fact that the evacuees were supposed to return home or would come back home, does this segment here of the interview correspond to what you heard Ieng Sari say about the return of the evacuees?
This is an article which I have read, and my response is based on this article.
Thank you. Now, I'd like to return to your departure, and in your book, reference D151/1.2, you mentioned on pages 31 and 32 in the French version, and in Khmer, the ERN is 00831090-91. And you said that before leaving Paris for Cambodia, your group of fellow travelers had signed a statement which they provided to the press. Who wrote out this statement?
That I do not know. It must have been somebody who was close to Ieng Sari, but I had no idea who he was.
And what was the statement about that was produced just before you left France?
This statement was about the assertion by the Cambodian returnee that they were willing to return to Cambodia, and the motivation for their return was because they did not believe in the news that was run by media controlled by the imperialists.
And were the media controlled by the imperialists already saying about Cambodia? Were there already any allegations against the regime in Cambodia by the media controlled by the imperialists?
There were some allegations about the atrocity committed in Cambodia, and there were news articles published by French newspaper and newspapers in other countries reporting about the atrocity, heinous crimes committed during the Democratic Cambodia. And later on, Father Francois Pong-Cho also published a book entitled Cambodia Year Zero.
So, before packing up to leave for Cambodia, were you given any recommendations about what you should bring along with you or not bring along with you?
The main advice for us at that time was that we should bring along with us only one package or one sacked because we came to Cambodia in order to help reconstruct the country, so we did not have to bring anything much with us.
And did Ying Seri ask you, whether directly or indirectly, to bring something to Cambodia?
Indirectly, the returnees received a document from the diplomatic mission of Cambodia based in Paris, but I cannot recall, or I don't know the content of that document.
Thank you. Now let me return briefly to K15 and ask you a few more questions in regard to those that were put to you yesterday. You said that you were growing vegetables at K15, but were you told who would be receiving these vegetables?
Generally, we were not given instruction as to where the vegetable would be supplied to, but generally we were told that we had to cultivate or grow vegetable in order to be self-sufficient.
So you arrived at K15 a few months after your wife did, and after a few other people had returned to Cambodia. But did other intellectuals continue arriving at K15 during the 3 months you were there? And would they settle there?
When I was talking to the official of this court, I stayed in B15 for. I came to B15. No, rather, I stayed in B15 for 6 months, not for 3 months. And when I was staying there, in my observation, I witnessed that a large number of Cambodian people who stayed there were taken to Talay. I did not know its whereabouts in Phnom Penh, but it was somewhere out in the outskirts of Phnom Penh. And they also took away some of the. I also noticed that there were soldiers who took some of us away as well.
Maybe I did not express myself clearly, witness. What I wanted to know was whether other intellectuals were still arriving after you returned to Cambodia, therefore would come straight from the airport and travel straight to K15. Were there several waves of intellectuals who traveled to K15 in the weeks following your return to Cambodia?
President, are you talking about K15 or K5? Because I heard from the translation, sometime you refer to K5 and at other time you refer to K15. So can you please clarify whether or not you are referring to K15? President. Mr. Prosecutor, please repeat your last question. Because through the translation, I heard K5 was mentioned, and at the other time, K15 was mentioned. So please clarify your last question so that the witness can respond to it appropriately.
Yes, thank you, Mr. President. It is indeed K15, that is, say 1-5. So my question was whether other waves of intellectuals who were returning to Cambodia voluntarily traveled to K15 after you had already arrived there.
Yes, there were other waves of intellectuals arriving. As my brother-in-law, Rosaran, and his family members and other Cambodian people also came to this office.
Now, in terms of how K15 was organized, as well as the other sites where you were sent to later on, did the Khmer Rouge cadres nominate detainees among the intellectuals to run or to manage the other prisoners? Did they use certain of the detainees, for example, as relays to ensure discipline?
At K15, Pum was the officer in charge, and he had with him several subordinates. And then in this K15s, they divided the returnees into different groups, and they designated a team leader. And the situation was like the German treating the US. They designated the team leader in order to supervise the work of the team and reported to the officer in charge.
Did this generate tension within the intellectuals who had returned from abroad? The fact that there would be people who were given this position, and also maybe because you participated in self-criticism and criticism sessions, did all this result in tension among you?
This working procedure, as you can well imagine, if we were residing there and then we did not have access to food and other necessity, and then we did not have communication with outside, but then with ourselves we had somebody who was the team leader, but then we did not have any things to eat or food or water to drink. So you can well imagine if they offer only half a glass of water, then we would try to snatch the water in order to drink. So that can be well imagined that argument is very fragile. So in that situation, even if they love each other before, but argument was very likely, and those who were designated to be the team leader had to try to please people who were in charge over there. So the atmosphere within K15 was of mistrust, and that was the tactics of Angkar. They wanted to re-educate, and they also encourage us to self-criticize ourselves, and we have to criticize each other as well. For example, they would talk about people back when they were in France, for example, and then in that meeting they discuss things such as these individuals were former pro-Soviet Union and others were pros any political trend also. So the conflict was looming actually in the teams, and people did not trust each other.
Thank you. If I refer to your book and to your written record of interview, after having gone through K15 and D2, you went to a hospital and then you were sent to Takmau. Is that correct, witness?
Pouvez-vous nous dire
Witness, that is correct.
Can you tell us if the living and working conditions at Takmau were similar or better or worse than at K15 or at D2?
But
the condition was getting worse, particularly when we were transferred to Takmau, and then the situation was even worse when we were in Bang Trabai.
Nous allons rester.
Let's focus on Takmau for the moment. Were you allowed to be sick? And what would happen if you fell ill, for example?
When we were in Takmau, we were not allowed to be sick. And if we were found sick or ill, our food regime would be reduced.
And what kind of work did you have to perform at Takmau, very briefly speaking?
There were different targets of task. For example, we had to clear bushes in order to make way for vegetable plantation, and we grow vegetable like in other camps as well. But when I was in Takmau, what was noting was that the condition over there was very bad, because before I left for the factory, some Cambodians over there went to work in Angkor Chai, and there were a lot of mistreatment of people by the cadres over there, and they told us about the life condition at Angkor Chai, the starvation people had to suffer, and the ill treatment by the cadres over there. So we got very annoyed at that time, and then we found that if we discussed about Angkars, then we would be considered enemies or so. So we got very irritated at the time.
And during this period, did Khmer Rouge cutters speak to you about this concept of enemy? What did this notion signify for the Khmer Rouge back then? Who were the enemies?
The main enemies were the enemies within ourselves, the enemies that was hidden in ourselves.
And at Takmao, were things like at 15 or at D2, you were still considered people from the funk and not revolutionaries?
But
Yes, that is correct. But at D2, the chairman of the factory was kind. He was not as cruel as the leader at the Khmer camp.
Pourquoi
Why was it badly looked upon to be categorized as belonging to the funk?
Pardon, est-ce que c'était parce que vous avez...
Was it because you had joined the revolution a little later on than others?
The President, Defense Council, you may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. President. Again, I have been rather patient all afternoon. The gentleman is leading. Here again, he asks a question, and then he provides the answer, and then he asks whether the gentleman can verify it. He's been doing that repeatedly, over and over and over again. Now, I don't want to be objecting on every question, because you are professional judges, but there has to be a limit. He can ask a question and ask the witness to provide the answer, not give the witness the answer and say, is that the reason? That's a classic leading question. And if your honors, are going to be sustaining every single objection that comes from the prosecution, we expect for you to sustain our objections when we raise the same issues. This is incredible, this amount of leading.
Monsieur le Président, je...
Let me cut the question in half then and start with the first part. Why was it looked down on if you belonged to the category of people from funk?
I do not have any response to this question, but personally, after I had a talk with my wife, we considered who we were or what class we were in. Because we had nothing, we could not be a bourgeoisie or petty bourgeoisie, as we only have a small bag with us with a few clothes as the rest of the poor peasants and workers. What was the difference between us and those people? And my wife said the difference was that we went to school, but they did not. And I believe what he said was correct.
Qui dirige...
Who was supervising the Takmao site when you were there?
His revolutionary name was Yut.
Est-ce que
And at the time, did you know what body or ministry Takmau site belonged to?
No, I don't. Because since my arrival from overseas, my only reason was because I came at it as a request and appealed by Ieng Sari. So in my mind, I was thinking that it was under his supervision, but there is nothing to use as the evidence to support my thinking.
Merci.
Thank you very much. In Takmau, did any of the intellectuals or the people who were there try and run away from the camp?
Yes. There was one person, Chau Say Nong, that was the name. He came from France and he flew with my wife. And when I was at Khmer, I saw him and he was sick. And he was not allowed to stay at his house, but to stay under the house of the chief of the camp. They isolated him and did not allow people to contact him. And one night, one day, soldiers rang the bell for us to go to attend a meeting. And they said that Chau Seng Nong tried to flee from the Khmer and that he had fled. And they said that he was a traitor, and after that we were dispersed to return to work. And it became quiet after, but a few days later there was a rumor that he had been arrested. But we never saw him, and the situation became quiet again. But later on, I saw his name at S21.
Can you tell us how long you stayed, roughly, in Takmau, and where were you taken after that?
sans consulter le livre?
If possible, without consulting the book. If you could, please answer the question, if you remember.
It was in late 1976, probably in October or November. Yes, around that, October or November, as I stayed there for about 1 month, or a little bit more than 1 month.
Et où avez-vous été?
And where did you go after that month?
After that, our group was transferred to Bang Trobay.
យកពួកខ្ញុំទៅមន្ទីរបឹង
we were sent to Bang Trabait, but some members of the group were sent elsewhere. At that time, I didn't know where they were sent to, but later I learned that they were taken to S21.
Merci.
Thank you. Let us briefly dwell on your first stay in Bang Trabek. When you got there, did you meet up with a lot of friends or intellectuals who you had known earlier, and maybe even from other camps, such as K15?
Yes, I knew when we arrived at Bang Trabait. It was around November that year, and I learned that K15 was closed, and all Cambodian people from overseas were gathered and sent to Bang Trabait.
Y avait-il beaucoup?
Were there a lot of people in Bang Trabait?
There were more people than in the Khmer, but if you compare to the thousands of people coming from overseas, it was less than that.
Et au niveau des
Were the people in Bang Trabait just intellectuals, or were there other categories of people?
There were other categories of people. There were a few Khmer Rouge cadres whose names I cannot recall. And besides, there were Cambodians from overseas.
Quand vous dites
When you say Cambodians from overseas, precisely where did they come from? Did they come from different places? Cambodians, all of them, of course, but were they from different countries?
Yes, they came from various countries, but the majority came from France. A small number were from Soviet, but there were only a few of them, as many of them had disappeared. President, thank you, Mr. Witness and the prosecutor. The time is now appropriate for a short recess, and we will take a break and return at 3 p.m. Court officer, could you assist the witness during the recess and have him returned to the courtroom at 3 p.m.
សូមអញ្ជើញក្រោកឈរ